Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving into something absolutely fascinating, the evolution of African literature. We're going to trace a really remarkable journey, starting from ancient oral traditions passed down through generations, all the way to the global prominence of modern bestsellers. Literature, as we know, does a lot more than just entertain us. It reflects a society, it preserves history, and it shapes our very identity. It's both incredibly creative and deeply educational, and honestly, nowhere is that truer than in the subject of today's explainer.
Let's kick things off with a pretty compelling question. If I write a book and set it in Africa, does that automatically make it African literature? Well, you might initially think, yeah, sure, but it turns out geography is really just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
To see what I mean, take Joseph Conrad's famous 1899 novel, Heart of Darkness. It physically takes place in the Congo, but Conrad was a European writer, and his portrayal reflects a strictly colonial perspective. Now, contrast that with someone like Aimé Césaire. He's from Martinique in the Caribbean, literally an ocean away from Africa. Yet his work is absolutely considered part of the African literary tradition. Why? Because it's tied together by a shared, deep-rooted history of Black identity, colonization, and slavery. That right there shows us why writers like Césaire belong to this literary tradition, while European writers like Conrad simply do not.
So here's how we're going to break it all down today. First, we'll define true African literature. Then we'll explore the oral tradition era, look at colonialism and negritude, dive into postcolonialism and African realism, check out contemporary voices in feminism, and finally, wrap up with the reclaimed global narrative. We are exploring exactly how an entire continent wrote its own identity back into existence.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, Defining True African Literature Beyond Geography.
The real defining factor of this literature isn't just a spot on a map. It's about deep cultural roots and shared historical experiences. We're talking about works that tackle massive, world-altering events like slavery, colonialism, the fight for independence, and globalization. And it's incredibly diverse, written in African languages, sure, but also European ones like English, French, and Portuguese. Ultimately, it's about expressing genuine African worldviews, struggles, and hopes.
Now, this literature didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It evolved through broad historical stages closely linked to major events on the continent. Think of this timeline as our roadmap for today. We have three main umbrella periods. We start with the pre-colonial period, stretching from ancient times up to the 19th century. Next, the colonial period takes over from the 19th century through the 1950s. And finally, the post-colonial period, which kicks off in the 1950s and brings us right up to the present day.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Oral Tradition Era, covering ancient times to the 19th century.
Long before European languages were introduced, storytellers were the ultimate keepers of literature. In West Africa, you had these master storytellers called griots. They didn't just speak. They used memory, music, and dramatic performance to pass down a really vibrant oral tradition. And there was a huge variety here. You've got East African folk tales, wise proverbs, and complex myths like the Yoruba creation myth of Ile Ife. Plus, massive epic stories like the Sanjata epic from Mali, and of course those clever trickster tales like the famous Anansi spider stories from Ghana.
But here's the thing you have to realize. These stories were not just for entertainment, not at all. They functioned as a living, dynamic system of traditional governance. When a griot shared a proverb or performed an epic, they were actively teaching moral lessons. They were preserving critical history, regulating social behavior, and literally strengthening the bonds of their community. This oral literature was, without a doubt, the glue holding ancient African societies together.
Next up is Section 3, Colonialism and Negritude, from the 19th century to the 1950s.
As colonization took hold, education systems introduced literacy in English, French, and Portuguese. And interestingly, Africans began using those exact languages to document their own experiences. Writers like Samuel Ajayi Crowther, J.E. Casely Hayford, and Mouloud Ferroun started writing slave narratives and documenting the really harsh realities of colonial rule. The literature from this time is heavily defined by intense cultural conflict. That incredibly difficult struggle to balance deep-rooted African traditions with overwhelming Western pressure. Eventually, this cultural defiance became highly organized. In the 1930s, as a powerful reaction against French assimilation policies, French-speaking intellectuals sparked what became known as the Negritude Movement. Founded by figures like Léopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal, Aimé Césaire from Martinique, and Léon Gontran Damas from French Guiana, this movement had a very clear, uncompromising goal. They wanted to firmly reject colonial racism and loudly celebrate Black identity, traditions, and values. It was a real game changer that directly fueled broader anti-colonial pride.
All right, Section 4, Postcolonialism and African Realism, spanning the 1950s to the 1980s.
So, independence finally brings freedom and self-determination, but guess what? It also brought complex new problems. Post-colonial authors like Wole Soyinka and Ngugi wa Thiong'o urgently used their platforms to rewrite African history from their own perspectives, rather than the colonizers. But they definitely didn't shy away from self-critique. Their works deeply explored the messy struggles of nation-building, highlighting really tough themes like political corruption, public disillusionment, and that haunting ongoing legacy of colonialism.
During this time, we also see the rise of African realism, which essentially turned the pen into a weapon for social change. Moving into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, writers were exposing harsh realities like dictatorships and institutionalized inequality. A stark example of this is in South Africa, where apartheid was the central concern. Writers like Nadine Gordimer and Alex Laguma dedicated their work to exposing the deep injustices, poverty, and severe oppression caused by that system. They proved that literature can absolutely fight for real-world social change.
Let's move into the modern era with Section 5, Contemporary Voices and Feminism, from the 1970s to the present.
Contemporary African literature has this incredible continent-wide scope now. We're talking about stories exploring everything from global migration and modern technology to urban life and trauma. And crucially, African women writers have completely transformed the landscape. Authors like Mariama Ba, Tsichi Dangarmga, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie are writing fiercely about patriarchy, gender inequality, and female empowerment. They are actively dismantling not just the remnants of colonial oppression, but also the traditional systems that limit women, reflecting a deeply modern, hybridized African identity.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, a reclaimed global narrative, the ultimate triumph.
Let's look at the number 5. What does it represent here? It represents the 5 distinct African writers who have been awarded the absolute highest honor in the literary world, the Nobel Prize in Literature. That alone firmly cements the global importance and, frankly, the unmatched quality of African storytelling.
We have Nigeria's Wole Soyinka in 1986, Egypt's Naguib Mahfouz in 1988, South Africa's Nadine Gordimer and J.M. Coetzee, all the way to Tanzania's Abdulrazak Gurnah in 2021. These laureates prove, without a doubt, that African literature has successfully commanded the world's attention. It shifted the narrative from local resistance to a globally celebrated art form.
And this brings us to a landmark masterpiece that is almost always at the center of studying this topic: Chinua Achebe's 1958 novel, Things Fall Apart. This book perfectly encapsulates the mission to restore African dignity. Achebe uses the novel to demonstrate with beautiful clarity that Igbo society was highly structured, dynamic, and well-governed long before European colonialism ever arrived on their shores.
Achebe's work represents the ultimate triumph of African literature, actively challenging and dismantling harmful colonial misrepresentations. Remember Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness from our first few slides? Conrad portrayed Africa as primitive, chaotic, and lacking history. Well, Achebe's work acts as a direct, powerful counter-narrative. He presents a highly organized, vibrant, and incredibly complex African society. He literally reclaims the narrative from the colonizer and hands it back to its rightful owners.
African literature is a profound reminder that who tells the story matters just as much as the story itself. From ancient oral griots to modern Nobel laureates, this continent has written its identity, its struggles, and its triumphs for the whole world to see. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. How do the stories you read shape your view of the world around you? And what happens when a culture finally reclaims the pen? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating journey with me.